Any last words before we start?
Let's get it started in here. And debates keep running, running, and running.
On that note, that's a perfect intro to today's episode of insulation of power versus making progress. So welcome to that fun intro for the Modern Day Apocrypha podcast.
I'm so glad you just committed me to using that as our intro. Just rolled right into it.
It was gold, and I was like, nah, we're going with this.
Welcome, everybody. So on today's episode of Modern Day Apocrypha, today we're talking about the insulation of power. And just the general idea here is that too often, if we look throughout history and even current times, we notice that people are trying to maintain their position of power instead of looking at a progressive viewpoint and trying to, make things better for themselves or life in general, others.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like there's these moments where people kind of you're building your influence, you're building your legacy, and whether that's an individual or a company, a nation, a group of people, whatever. And then it gets to that spot where I can continue progressing, but that progress is going to cost this pile of gems or whatever I've collected. And you have to make this choice of like, do I continue for progress sake, or do I like insulate my little stash that I've made, whatever that stash may be? So
yeah. And so when we just started talking about this, one of the thoughts that came to my mind was it's almost like a selfish play, but I didn't want to say that because it's also not necessarily just selfish per se. Like, it kind of feels like if you're trying to insulate your position of power, it's, for your own good, but maybe there are other ulterior motives in there. And I'm not thinking of one off the top of my head, but I'm curious to kind of see where this conversation goes and see what we discover.
Well, before we get into any specifics, in my mind, you think, sure, if it's just an individual and just their stuff, insulating can be seemingly selfish. But what if you've built up, I know a lot of people like to look at the ultra rich and be like, oh, they should be paying for the world to not be hungry, or they should be responsible for this or that. And I think that's a whole nother topic in and of itself. But what I'm getting at is you have somebody like a Jeff Bezos, right? Which probably isn't a great example, but we'll use an extreme one. He's collected all of this wealth from the value he's built in Amazon, and you've got that choice of like, okay, well, sure, you could take some of that wealth and go distribute it, whatever. Or, you know what, let me make sure me and my people, and that his people could be his direct family. It could be all of Amazon. It could be whatever, So when you're thinking through that, what is that buzzing? Oh, that's
lots of notifications.
It's like, what is going on? Nick's phone was buzzing. I'll tell you about our ghetto setup later. It's just gonna keep buzzing. That's hilarious. Anyways, what I was getting at was your group of people that you're insulating could be 10, 1,000, 100,000 people. And so at that point, is it really selfish to insulate what you've created, or is it altruistic? You know what I mean? So like it's not necessarily black and white. I want to set that stage up front that yes, progress is great, but sometimes progress has to come at the right time, and people have to be ready for that cost that it takes to make for progress.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's kind of like the idea of you've got to have a certain amount to give back in order to make a meaningful impact.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, we took down a couple of different examples to discuss on this episode. And I think that's going to be interesting is to see like if we take that mindset and see if it applies to some of these other examples, because I didn't go into looking at one of the topics that I wrote down was the Catholic Church and how they've insulated their power.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see if that's going to apply to some of these other examples beyond just like Jeff Bezos, because his is very much stemming from wealth itself, like real fiscal power. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the Catholic Church, it's almost more like an oppression of knowledge.
Sure.
Like they didn't want people to know how to read the Bible. And you know what, let me caution that by saying it's not so much that that they've explicitly stated that they don't want people to read the Bible. But if you start understanding the history there, people who were able to read and interpret the Bible on their own put the power of the Pope and the Catholic Church at risk. And so that's kind of like the general idea here.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, since you brought it up, let's go into that one a little bit more.
Yeah, certainly. So the idea behind the Catholic Church is that if you look way back in history, we're talking like the 1400s, before your average person knew how to read. The Catholic Church...
That's crazy. Hold on a second. That's just crazy to think about. There was a time where most people didn't know how to read.
Right. Yeah. So, like the common mode of communication was just verbal communication, and that's been throughout the majority of history, and that's where you get like folklore and all these stories, whether it's like the Odyssey. I don't know if this is actually true, but Homer's The Odyssey was memorized, and it was told by like your grandmother or your grandfather, and it wasn't until years later that it was written down, because your average person didn't know how to write and read. And so scribes, like basic math and basic writing came from scribes who had to keep track of markets. And so like if a king had, I don't know what they were selling, but let's just say gold. Yeah. They're selling gold, right? And they would have to say like, well, how many gold coins did I get rid of? Well,
for like inventory, basically.
Exactly. And so that they knew how, exactly, for inventory. And so they would hire a scribe who knew how to, I'm using air quotes here for anybody that's listening, but right. But he was more like doing tallies, like 1, 2, 3, 4, slash through the 4 to make it 5, right? Yeah. And so that's kind of like how reading and writing in theory came to be, or at least that's what people think. And so, going back to the conversation about the Catholic Church, like all the way through the 1400s, there was no printing press. So books were very valuable. And so not many people even needed to know how to read, because it's not like you had a book unless you were very well off. Yeah. Can you imagine having to write a book? Yeah.
It's not like, me writing down the random bullshit that comes into my mind and like, maybe I'll collect these and rearrange it and pretty it up later on. Like, no, you got to have your thoughts in order and write it down all in order to write your book.
There's no backspace.
There is no backspace. And then to make copies of it, if you want to sell more than one of your book, now you got to pay some other dude to just sit and like write down your stuff and hope he doesn't screw it up.
Exactly. And so that's actually precisely what the Catholic Church did. It's almost like you read right into my mind. So the Catholic Church, you had monks that would learn Latin traditionally, because that's what people spoke. Sure. In European empires. So anyway, these monks learned Latin, and they would actually like read, interpret, and write the Bible, so that they would produce copies and things like that. And so you can see the system where if everybody follows the Catholic Church more or less as law back then, like it was very much used that way. You still had your kings that had their own law and order, but the Catholic Church held power over the kings and the monarchs in European society. And so if your average person didn't know how to read, think about it like this. They didn't know how to read the Bible. They didn't know how to read the book of law, if you will. Yeah. And so those who did held all the power. Yeah. And in that time, it was the Catholic Church.
And so they could have actually read, like, in a service, read what was actually written down, or they could have made up whatever they wanted and no one would have known, because they were the only ones who knew how to read the book, so they could have shifted whatever they want for their own purposes.
So enter Martin Luther. So this is about the Protestant Revolution, and I'm not using this as so much of like a history lesson, but more of an example of, insulating your power so that you could control other people. And so Martin Luther comes in. This is like in the early 1500s, like 1505, I want to say. And he's a Catholic monk. And in his town, which is in Germany, or it may not have been called Germany back then. It was probably the Prussian Empire. Hell, that was probably even before the Prussian Empire. But anyway, so modern day Germany, this monk hears the Catholic Church coming in, and they're selling what are called indulgences. Well, what is an indulgence? Well, if you're Catholic, you believe in purgatory, which means that there's like this waiting period before you go to heaven or have your day of judgment.
I've always imagined purgatory like the DMV.
Yes, I think of it like that too. That's
Like,
hilarious.
Fuck, we're all here. Nobody's happy about it. The people who are working this place don't want to be here either. Like, just next. Okay, whatever. Go see what happens with your life.
So you think there's just like a row of angels and they're just like,
But like the
Tony,
most
come on up.
apathetic angels you've ever met. Like, I don't give a fuck. All right, well, go into that room. You'll either go upstairs or downstairs after that. Well, they'll tell you. Just follow the arrows.
while you're waiting, there's a jug of water. Like, help yourself.
Yep. Anyways, purgatory, indulgences.
So yeah, the church is selling indulgences, which basically meant that you could pay a certain number of marks, their currency, to reduce the amount of time you spent in purgatory.
So it's like greasing the bouncer to cut the line.
Yeah, so that's basically what it is. But from like a real
Religious
it had
perspective,
real
yeah.
implications because like this was before the scientific method where people had a lot of faith in science. It was
Sure.
like religion was very much what you followed. It was
That
law.
was the worldview,
It was
yeah.
your life. It was your guiding principles. And if you didn't, like, it was hell for you. And it's not like, I don't think I'm going to hell. It's like, no, the vast majority of people believed
That was
in
the
this
reality
system.
at that point. Yeah.
Exactly. And so Martin Luther, who had read the Bible, understood that there's a line in the Bible that basically states, I'll summarize, you don't have, your actions are not what gets you into heaven. It's your faith. Nothing more than your faith gets you into heaven. So it's like, believe in Jesus and you're good. Like, that's it. And so it's not you pay money to the church so that they can expand their empire or whatever their reasoning was, whatever they tried to make their selling point was for these indulgences.
Yeah.
It was like Martin Luther says that, yeah, you just have to be a good Christian and that's it. So a lot of people know this story, but he nails this piece of paper that are just basically a list of grievances with why it's not okay to buy indulgences and why it doesn't matter if you look at the actual scripture. And so he's basically making it known that the Catholic Church is doing a lot of horseshit and scamming people.
So, question, I'm following, but if your common people can't read, what's the point of putting something in a written format to the door?
So the story goes that he stood outside that church and spoke to the people.
Got it.
And this was his, I want to say it was like 93 grievances.
As it was 90 something, yeah.
So, you know, I'm going way back years ago from learning the story, right? But
Yeah.
anyway, so obviously the Catholic Church had a problem with that. And long story short, this one instance led to the Protestant Revolution. So a Protestant is any form of Christianity that is not Catholicism.
Got it.
So that'd be like Baptist, Methodist, and, you know, all these other different churches. If you're from America, they're very prevalent here. I don't know if that's true around the rest of the world or if it's very
I don't
heavily
know.
Catholic. I'm not sure.
I know there's spots that are still super Catholic, or like the Greek Orthodox Church, which is very similar to Catholicism. Different, but very similar, and it's like very specific traditions and stuff like that.
Right. A lot of Latin American countries are very heavily Catholic.
Yep, absolutely.
So, you know, this might be a very American viewpoint. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's what led to the Protestant Revolution. And that's where, like, the Catholic Church started losing all of this power. Don't get me wrong, it held its power for a very long time after that. But you started branching off, and people were like, well, with the Baptists, I think the idea was that they were like, yeah, we don't believe that you should just baptize your baby right off the bat. Like, our interpretation of the Bible is different. And around the same time as Martin Luther was the printing press came out, and so more and more copies of the Bible were readily available. More and more people started learning how to read, and the Catholic Church ultimately started losing power. And then you have the scientific method come in, and the church has to, you know, kind of reverse some of its thoughts about astrology and the way that astronomy, excuse me, not astrology. And they had to like reverse some of that. And so just over time, they started losing their power. but the Catholic Church was very much about like oppressing Martin Luther and Lutheranism or Lutheranism, excuse me.
Yeah.
And it was so that they could preserve their power.
So taking it back to the beginning, I'm trying to think of like, what's the point or takeaway we can have for that? Maybe there isn't one.
Well, like this is an example of some of the things that we want to talk about here.
Yeah, that's true.
So like the Catholic Church, using that as an example, I guess one of the takeaways here is that you should look at finding a way, or we as individuals should look at finding a way to be more educated and be more self-sufficient so that we can recognize those things. Because if you're not educated, in this case, very much just like you don't know how to read,
right?
Then you can't stand up for yourself. And so like a modern day example might be the internet. So if you don't know how to use the internet or use computers, you're going to get left behind and you can't stand up for yourself.
I was thinking about that as you were going through your story, and I didn't want to interrupt you in the middle of it. And I'm glad you brought it up because it brought it back to me. So kind of like how most people didn't have access to information because it wasn't common to read. And it's just kind of like settling in my mind why, we live in like an information age where learning how to read and communicate is everything. Mm-hmm. Whereas back then, I mean, reading was for high class people. I don't have time for that. I need to go make sure my farm is tended to so that my family can eat, and so thinking of that shift as that became more available, and then if it became more available, then it became more valuable and more of a needed or required skill. And so with the pre-internet, right? Sure, people can read, but they're only handed the information that comes to them. So either the books they seek out or consistent trusted information like newspaper or news sources like the radio, television, stuff like that.
Right.
So not saying it was or wasn't, because I feel like we've kind of touched on this before, but that in and of itself was a potential opportunity for a narrative to be shifted or controlled, similar to like the Catholic priests. They were the only ones who could read. I'm the only one who has a microphone in the era of radio, or I'm the only one who has a broadcast station, or I'm the only one who has whatever. So it's not necessarily readily available to find different perspectives or dig or do research or whatever. But now on the internet, we see the lack of distrust of the media and stuff like that. And like 16 different perspectives on any one thing. If you look, you'll find it something disagreeing or agreeing with you online. So I feel like we've shifted past that, like, okay, cool, now we have greater perspective, but it's almost like we're inundated with too much perspective. So how do we filter that and make some sense out of it?
Yeah, and how do you know like who's a trustworthy source and who's not? And so it's nice that everybody has a voice, and the internet definitely is what enabled that.
100%.
And it makes it harder for governments to suppress their population. But to your point, like everybody having a voice means that anybody, qualified or unqualified, maybe it doesn't even matter if they're qualified or not, but everybody can just spit out whatever they want, and you see every individual person's viewpoint.
Like we're doing right now.
Exactly. Yep. And so it's a lot to just like shoot out into the media. But the nice thing is that it puts the power in the individual, because the individual can say, look at all of these choices that I have. If I listen to one podcast over and over, let's say like 20 episodes, and then I start realizing like, hey, you know what? I've already heard 3 out of 20 that had a bunch of bullshit in them. I'm going to stop listening to that.
Yeah.
Because I got other options. Like I can go listen to somebody else. But back in the day, like let's say in the 50s, where you had like 5 channels, and that might even be a lot.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, you know what? That sounds like some bullshit, but channel 3 is also saying the same thing.
So it must be true.
I can go to channel 4 and they're showing Jeopardy. It's like...
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there's like pros and cons for both scenarios, right? So you've got an earlier scenario where there's only maybe 1 or 2 voices, and they're pretty much all saying the same thing, and it's this loud, resounding megaphone. So it's really easy for sometimes progress to be made in a certain direction if that's where the megaphone's pointing you. But to get progress outside of what whoever's behind that megaphone is saying, it's really difficult because it's hard to get progress just by yourself, right? You typically need people. I mean, biologically, we're wired to be community type people or beings, whatever. And so then now it's nice that everyone has a voice, but if you just like close your eyes and imagine everyone talking, it's just noise, right? So how do you accomplish anything? Like, it's good that everyone's empowered to have that voice, but I feel like sometimes progress is completely slowed or come to a halt, because it's harder to sift through and find your tribe because you're not forced into just this, well, these are the only people I know.
Right.
So it's more challenging, and I think there's more opportunity, but it's definitely more work.
Yes, definitely more work. And one of the things that we're experiencing now as a result is that we're looking at like Facebook and Twitter and being like, hey, can you let us know whenever this is fake news? Like this whole fake news trend, it's because anybody can spit something out.
Yeah.
And it will pick up momentum. And it's a good thing that anybody can spit things out because, again, it means that it's harder to oppress a society. But again, it's like there's a lot of fake news, and that leads to real implications in the world.
Well, and the other part that's scary about that too is, let's say they go through and they're trying to autocorrect and fix it and say, oh, this is fake. How easy it is to go right back to a previous system where something's true, but it doesn't fit with the narrative of those in control. Oh, guys, that's fake. But here's this system that's proven all these other things fake. And I feel like that's been, the majority of like, the conspiracy theory, community is.
QAnon's real big right now.
There's a couple of probably real shit in the midst of it, but you know what? Let's partner it with all this other bullshit that's definitely crazy. And if you can agree that one of this is crazy, well, it's not that far from this. Cool, we've invalidated it.
Right.
So it makes like finding truth really hard.
It does.
I hate that.
Yeah, it really takes a lot of time and energy to sit down and understand a topic and like really dissect it. You can't just go to, your local news source and hear what they have to say and be like, yep, I got everything that I need to know now. It's like, no, now I've got to scrutinize it and be like, well, that actually didn't make sense. What did they mean by that? And then that's a whole topic in and of itself that you have to go and just unpack if you have the time. And if you have a family or if you're working long hours, like,
well, and if it's something that's trying to be hidden or covered, you can spend decades pulling at those strings and still not have the full picture.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Like that guy that was on Rogan's podcast a few months back, who wrote the book about the Manson murders and like the LSD experiments and stuff. And I think he's got a really good picture, but he even said, I had to just put the book out because I could have done this for another 20 years and still not been finished.
Right.
So yeah, that's interesting because, well, if I don't have, that's 20 years on one topic. How many topics are there out there? Especially like controversial topics. Like exactly. So how do you best leverage your time in the midst of all that?
And then you also have people who are experts in a field that we still distrust. So I'll use Fauci,
Sure.
Dr. Fauci, who anybody listening outside of the US may not be familiar with this, but he is.
I'm sure they all know by now.
You're probably right. But just for the record, he's basically the appointed medical personnel to represent how the United States is going to handle the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I'm not necessarily saying that he is or is not a trustworthy source, but there's just been so much conflicting information from Fauci to the World Health Organization to the CDC, and it's like all of this comes together. And these are the officials that are supposed to be trustworthy.
You think they'd be on the same page, right?
Right.
Like whether it is as bad as they say it is, or if they're making it up like some people claim, I don't.
I read something today that only 6% of the people that had died, of the 153,000 cases I think we're at right now, only 6% actually died from COVID.
From COVID alone.
Right.
Right? It was, everything else was a complication with something else.
And then so like for us, we've got to be like, well, what does that mean? Like, well, if COVID causes pneumonia, then somebody who got COVID and then as a result got pneumonia and died, like, yeah, I think that should be counted as a COVID death, but does somebody else? And like, I don't know, man. It just gets way out of control.
It gets muddy so quick.
It does.
And you would think that, let's just say those three big players that you talk about, whether they're telling the truth or they're trying to sell a lie, either direction, you'd think they'd be on the same page. Closely on the same page, you know, so that it would be kind of believable. But the stuff that they're saying is so like far apart from each other and contradicting, and you're like, okay, well then maybe I need to pay more attention to all this other contradictory stuff that's coming from every level beneath it. And it's like, well, fuck. How do I know what's real?
So I think you touched on one thing here. So like, if we use the Catholic Church example, so they didn't want people to be educated about how to read and how to interpret the Bible because that threatened their power. Well, I think it's too early to say, and we're too still much in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic.
Sure.
But let's just say that if the federal government had a motive for trying to keep us in quarantine, if you will, then this would hypothetically be an example of insulation of power. So instead of trying to like do what's best for everybody, if they've got a motive that they saw fit where if they could get everybody to quarantine, it would help them move their motive forward, then that's kind of like the insulation of power concept.
Right.
And again, like, I don't take that viewpoint, but I hear a lot of people do. And so I'd like to explore that idea at some point. But for me, it's like quarantining yourself only hurts the economy and it only hurts the power that the government ultimately has, unless it were, well, like, let's say that if the riots happened before quarantine, not shortly after.
Right.
Then it'd be like, well, they're going to use COVID-19 as an excuse to make sure everybody's quarantined and quell the riots.
Right.
So that might be a narrative that gets spun up, and you can really see how a conspiracy theory would happen if the order of events were just off by 1 month. It's interesting.
Yeah, dude, that is super interesting. It's crazy to think that we might not ever get to the bottom of some of these things, you know, like, that's why I enjoy our comments so much, because we get to explore a little bit, and at least once a week I get to do some mind exercise with somebody who I know will match me and at least explore and see where it goes.
Throw something on a wall and see what sticks.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
What else we got in here that is another good example of this that we can kind of explore?
Yeah, so, you know, I haven't really thought out all of these ideas, but I just put down some examples of things that came to mind. So another one that came across my mind was blacks in America, where, like, slavery is just a very obvious example of this. So I don't think that we even need to get into that. Like, it's very obvious that if you can remove all of the rights from somebody, that you're insulating your power and they can't do anything about it.
Yeah, that's not progress.
Right. Yeah. And you're doing it so that, like, your plantation, or I don't even like using the example of plantations because there are so many other industries that used slavery.
Yeah.
And I think that's like obviously a problem because that's preventing progress in an attempt to make sure that you're insulating your power as a plantation owner, as a factory owner, or whatever your industry is. But we see, you know, the slave movement die off with the 13th, 14th, and I think the 15th Amendment as well. And then you start hearing about, like, the Jim Crow laws and some of the ways that mortgage lenders were preventing Black Americans from living in certain parts of a city, or like they wouldn't let somebody live in a neighborhood. And so it's just kind of like an extension of that same concept. It's like,
yeah,
well,
someone said it was illegal to have slaves, but I don't agree with that, so let me find a loophole.
Yeah,
which is so fucked up.
It very much is, and albeit to a lesser extent as just like outright slavery.
Sure.
But it's the concept and the morality argument here that's at play. It's like you're oppressing somebody so that you can maintain power and hold a neighborhood that you want to be all of one class. And I think the same thing happens. Like you can look at the word ghetto comes from the Jewish ghettos, where I think this is true. I think it was in Germany in Hitler's time where he moved all of the Jews to what they called ghettos.
The poor places. And
right.
Yeah.
And so obviously, like if they just strip the Jewish people from all of their wealth and push them into these centralized areas, well, you have neighborhoods of object poverty, and those, like obviously the value of property there is going to just diminish. And so that's another example.
Well, and there's always exceptions to the rule too, but for the most part, people create what they see. And so if you grow up in poverty and that's all you've ever known, and that's all the people you know have ever known, it's hard to imagine something different.
Yeah, or even if you can imagine something different, it's easy to say, well, I got by just fine with what I had.
Right. Or they just got by what they had, so maybe I'll be fine if I don't reach or try to grow for more.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see those seemingly subtle moves to put a group or a class of people in a certain space. And just by keeping the boundaries blocked, like, hey, stay in these areas, stay over there, don't come mix with us who have maybe some more knowledge or perspective or understanding on how to make things better. Don't come learn those things, even by association. Stay over here. And in essence, you can keep a same reality while still checking the box of like, oh, we don't have slaves anymore, but we still have the less than people over there.
Yeah.
And it's like, damn. One, taking all emotion out of it, it's genius. In the same breath, it's fucked up. Like, I can't even imagine how to think like that.
Right.
Much less try to make that happen. So I guess while we're here, how do you reverse engineer that to flip it? Right? How do you so if by, hold on, give me a second to think this through before I just stumble on my words in a circle. Okay. So if people typically, birds of a feather flock together, right? How do you insert a different bird into that flock to change and elevate people's reality? You follow me? Am I making sense?
Yeah, I think so. So let me use an example. Oh my goodness, the dude just slipped my mind. Who's the guy who played Black Panther?
Yeah, that guy, King
Oh
T'Challa.
my
That's not his real name.
Chadwick.
Yep. Boseman? Is
Yes.
that right?
Chadwick Boseman. Nailed it. 10 out of 10.
He was such a great actor.
So I'm not a big movie watcher, so I haven't seen
okay.
any of the movies, but I did see some clips since it's been very publicized, and I had the same thought. I was like, wow, dude, he's like crushing it. And he played a lot of prominent roles. I really want to see the movie about Jackie Robinson.
You're the second person who's been like, dude, have you seen this movie? You got to check it out.
All right, noted. Well,
So it's like,
no, man. But so let's use him as an example since he's just a prominent figure right now.
Yeah.
How do you fix this? Well, I think that there's no one answer.
Sure.
And in fact, I've got another example written down that we can talk about in a moment. But since we were talking about like the racial or class type change or divide, you have somebody like Chadwick Boseman who can represent African Americans and serve as kind of like the role model, like somebody who kids can aspire to be.
Sure.
And the reason that came to mind is I saw some news coverage of kind of like a review of Chadwick Boseman's life. And somebody asked him why, this was in like an interview. Somebody asked him along the lines of, why was it so important for the Black Panther to have like a heavily black cast, a heavy black cast? And I was like, yeah, I'm kind of curious about that. Like, I like seeing the different ideologies and different representation of everybody because I think it helps us understand everybody and get a different view. But
totally agree.
He had a point that was interesting and something that I hadn't personally experienced. He said that when he was growing up, there was no role model like that to follow. And so it goes back to your point, Tony, where if you've grown up in an oppressed society where the most that you've ever known is somebody who hasn't achieved as much as you might aspire to achieve, then you don't really have that outside influence to say, hey, there is more that I can go and accomplish. Like, there's more to aspire for if you want it. Like, if you want it, it's there, you know?
Yeah.
And I think if it's hard for me to have this perspective, so it's something that, like, it's hard for me to relate to, but I can understand.
Mm-hmm.
So if I had never seen somebody who represents me and who I am achieve something great, then I might not ever think about, hey, I can go out and get that too.
Right. No, I totally agree. And it makes sense because even then it was not okay to have black people in movies. So you only ever saw white people. So like you're saying, for this guy, growing up, he only ever watched the movies, whatever. There was no one to, well, these are kind of cool and maybe these characters are kind of inspiring, but they're white, so I don't ever have that opportunity.
Right. And so it's like Black Panther, sure, Black Panther's a superhero, but what about Chadwick Boseman being
Right.
a superhero to real human beings?
Right. And not just one. Like, there's then that term of like, oh, we got to throw our diversity person in the movie. You know, your
Right.
your token, you know, black person, because people are starting to catch on and we can't let them revolt. So let's toss them a bone. No, let's make a whole, like, not just a small indie film for a small community, for everyone on the biggest, you know, like Marvel's been one of the biggest stages there have been for movies in the past few years. So on the biggest movie stage there is, let's make an almost all black cast and tie it in, and that all the white people who are normally the stars, they're the supporting characters.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're absolutely right. That was huge for them because it's like finally a moment of actual equality.
Right. Yep.
Which I didn't get it at the time. Like, I saw the black community getting like so hyped about the movie when it came out, and I didn't understand it. I'm like, it was a good movie, but I don't know why you guys are so jazzed about this. Now I get it. It was so much more than the movie.
Yep. It gives, I don't know, it's like a way of looking up, looking beyond yourself and your insular place where you've grown up and lived all your life.
Yeah. Well, can you imagine, like, growing up, hearing stories about your parents or your grandparents dealing with, you know, some of the crazy stuff that this country put black people through,
Mm-hmm.
and then tasting the difference of, like, man, all the stuff that they went through is finally paying off.
Yeah.
Like,
Or,
can you imagine how good that felt?
yeah, it's got to feel great.
Damn.
But on the flip side, it's like there's so much more, like such a long way to go still.
100%. 100% agree.
I think we could spend like all day talking about that specific topic. So
Yeah.
that very much can be a different episode.
Sure.
But I think just as an example there, it's like when we ground ourselves in the insulation of power, it's kind of like not giving the black community a voice helped protect a certain amount of power for a class in America. And like, that's inherently wrong to do that.
Sure.
You kind of asked about like, how do we solve some of those problems? And I think we'll have this conversation as we continue throughout this episode. But one note that I wrote down was just like contrary to the insulation of power was George Washington. And just the history there was, we all know that in the United States, there's a 2-term limit for the presidency. You can only be a president for 8 years at most. That wasn't always the case. That became, it was more of just tradition set in part by George Washington, because after his second term, he stepped down voluntarily and, you know, gave his reasons. It's like kind of all the same reasons why we want term limits to begin with.
Right.
And George Washington was, maybe we'll say ahead of his time, but anyway, set that precedent. And it wasn't until FDR had his 3-term presidency that they were like, whoa, like first and only guy to have 3 terms. Like, nah, I can't have that. So they made it law. I think it's an amendment in the Constitution. But anyway, that's kind of the idea there. And I thought that was neat because it's like, here's somebody who's willing to just give up his power voluntarily. Yeah. And that's what made it such a powerful statement.
Yeah, I can't imagine being president for one.
Sure.
And then, like, I can't even imagine the power trip you have to try to, like, offset. You know, like one of the biggest countries in the world who has a lot of influence in a lot of places, and you're the face of that. And I'm sure, or at least I hope, everyone going into that has good motives and wants to do the right thing and you know, better the nation and better people and all that. But I can't imagine having to try to stay that power in my mind of like, well, who gives a shit? I'm the guy, you know?
Right.
And so we see Trump doing a lot of those things, right? Where he's like, I'm president, y'all, I'm gonna tweet about it. Not for or against. I kind of sympathize with, I don't know if I could do it.
Just relinquish your power? Is that what you're saying?
Not to relinquish the power, not let power go to my head.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
In a place of power. And then the step after that is relinquishing it, because now it's in your head and it's like, ooh, well, I can't let go of this because it's a different type of rush. It's a different type of high. I think the closest thing I can relate to it is when I used to play music, right? When you're playing your own songs with a band on stage and there's people like singing along and loving your stuff, that's hard to replace. And then if you amplify that to 100,000 people or millions of people, that's a lot, you know? So I think I'm discovering for myself, at least right here in this conversation, some of the reasons why people insulate power, because, man, if I let this go, can I ever get it back?
Right.
You know, and maybe it's good that you don't get it back, but so I think that's part of the mental struggle in an individual.
I want to go down kind of like a primordial or primitive thought process here. So like, it seems like this idea of power or leadership, hierarchy, like whatever it gets labeled as.
Sure.
It's all a little bit different, so I don't want to confuse those terms, but it seems like it almost plays on like the primitive mind. Like, put yourself in a position where you are the leader of like a group of 12 early humans. And I mean, like, it's all hypothetical, but like, let's say like you overthrew somebody to become like the leader. Like, let's say that there's a conflict about whether or not you should cross this river, and maybe there is some distrust in your small little clan, your tribe, and maybe the leader died in the river crossing or something, or died defending in a war or something like that, a little skirmish. And it's like, okay, so now you're the next guy in line. You step up and you're leading this pack. If you think about it from that primitive mindset, would there ever be a time that that type of person willingly relinquishes their power? Or maybe it's even better to think about like even more primitive, like if we just look at like a pack of lions, a pride of lions. The male lion never gives up the power there. And
yeah,
like,
I guess someone just fills that vacuum when they die.
Yeah.
You know, and I think...
Or they try to overthrow the lead lion.
Once they're old and weak and they can't handle it. So I think it's the same thing in more primitive, like human tribal society. Or if you look a step further where you have, you know, kings either holding it till their death or till they're very old and then they hand it so they can kind of help that transition.
Yeah.
But yeah, like historically for a long, long time, people of power never let go of that power. That's an interesting observation.
And even today, it's probably still not the norm. Like,
Yeah.
look at Putin, look at Fidel Castro, look at some of the kings in the Middle East. I mean, hell, you still have the Queen of England in a very Western society. And granted, you know, like now they've got a prime minister, and so it has changed and evolved a little bit over there. But in China, like, it's very much, or even North Korea. I mean, just across the board, like,
there's a lot of places that are very not like us.
yeah, it's not normal to give up power. So I think that's what kind of the inherent beauty of what George Washington did to set that precedent. But like, let's not give him all the credit. Let's give credit to the world for looking at that and recognizing that that's a good model to follow.
Counterpoint, is it though? Okay.
Let's go down it.
Because, so 4 years isn't a lot of time, right? In the grand scheme of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, especially in our system where you've got, I mean, we've got our tiny independent parties, but for all intents and purposes, they kind of don't matter how our system is set up. So you've got your right and your left. And every so often, the pendulum swings to somebody else's favor. And it's like you spend your first 2 years trying to undo or redo what the person before you did, and then the last 2 years trying to do something. Well, if you switch every 4 or 8 years, and the first 2 years of the switch is trying to undo or redo or fix what you didn't agree with the last guy or girl did, is that really progress?
Right. Great question. So here's where my mind immediately went. There's no more efficient society, and I literally mean just efficient, but there's no more efficient society than that of a dictatorship.
Yeah.
Like, whatever Hitler wanted fucking happened. You know, like, that's efficiency. So what you described is, like, there's so much friction, and we hear that all the time. Like, there's friction in Congress, there's friction with the presidency itself, because you mentioned, you know, after you roll over. The good that comes out of it is that, or the hypothetical good that comes out of it, is that you would get a balance of ideas coming through. But I think what we're seeing is that right, left, they all kind of have the same ideas. And it's that of like, it feels like everybody's just trying to do what's best for themselves as congressmen and women.
Yeah. Instead of it being like footsteps, still moving forward, balanced, right, left, it's, we are two separate entities trying to move in our direction. And so it's like tug of war, I moved here. Nope. Tug of war, I moved a little back.
It's like a jumping jack.
Yeah.
Like left, right, instead of left, forward, right, forward. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So it definitely presents its problems, and it's certainly not efficient.
I'm curious to see, hopefully in the next, I'd like to see it in the next 10 years, but let's be more realistic. And probably in the next 100 years, we're going to have to come up with a new system. Yeah. Because I think initially, before people got so polarized in their views, you know, and I think different views is fantastic. You know, different perspectives helps create a bigger picture. We talked about that earlier. But now, at least in our country, the views are so polarizing, and there's almost like an identity you put on when you identify as a Democrat or Republican. And if both camps will hate you if you say, well, I'm a Democrat, but I like these things over here from the Republicans. And they're like, nobody wants you, go away. And that's the problem, is because we've made the two camps so polar opposite, and that it's not about working together as a collective to move forward. It's let's beat the Republicans. Let's overcome the Democrats. And that's what success looks like. And so a house divided against itself can't stand. Like we're literally we've created a system to fight ourselves. How the hell are we ever going to make progress? So eventually that'll implode. And hopefully it doesn't mean the whole U.S. goes to shit, but a different system will have to come into place that provides for progress not at the expense of ourselves.
Yeah, it almost in a way feels like maybe this is just my Amerocentric idea or bias here, but like it seems like America was the beacon of hope for the 20th century, which is like through the 1900s.
Whether it was or not, that's what we were told, but yes.
Right. That's definitely feels like my impression here. And so it almost seems like the world needs another beacon of hope.
Yeah.
Like what's next?
That's a really good point. And I think we know it, that we're not that anymore.
Yeah.
But there's, those of us who don't want to let go of that idea. And we're so afraid of that going to someone other than us. And so I think that comes where you see all of this craziness of pointing the finger at other countries and pointing this and that. And we've demonized everyone who's not us to try to hold on to the last shreds of hope that we are the hope and everyone else is evil. But I'm concerned that as a country, we're going to miss the next beacon of hope to emulate if we've demonized everyone and ostracized ourselves from it.
Do you ever think that maybe this massive military presence that the United States has is in and of itself insulation of power? Like it's like...
Explain.
So the United States is kind of... Let's look back after World War II. We had to build this huge navy to go and fight overseas because like it's not just we had to move soldiers over there. It's we had to move tanks and airplanes and all that shit.
Yeah.
Overseas. And nobody else had to do that. Why? Because the war was in their backyard.
Yep.
And so as a result, we had this massive military and we were like, well, we were just coming out of a time of isolationism, which kind of happened in the early 1900s, I think with like Teddy Roosevelt. And so it was like this idea that we should focus inward on ourselves. But then when we did, World War I happened and World War II happened. And it was like, well, fuck, like we got to go meddle in everybody's stuff. And I can understand how we came to that conclusion. I personally feel like that's not what's best, but there are other sides of that argument. So I want to be like fully transparent about that. But, now we've got this like massive military and we're spending shit tons of money on maintaining that military.
Just to maintain it.
Yeah. It's like I saw a number or a stat that said that the U.S. spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined.
Yep.
That's bonkers. So as the United States starts seeing the value of its dollar start to fall, the reserve currency status gets challenged. We are not manufacturing as much. Like it's like the influence seems like it's starting to fade. And so it's like, well, can we just hold on to our influence because we've just got a fucking tank in your country, And
I feel like we've been there for a while though, if we're being honest, right? And my fear is that if we do, and I'm sure it's other people's fear too, which is why we keep spending so much on our defense budget is insane. But I assume because we've pissed off so many people, we've pissed off so many people that if we were to let our guard down, I think the fear is that we'd get our shit kicked in.
And it could be, yeah. Or like Israel, for example, like we've, don't get me wrong, like Israel's full of badasses. First of all, for anybody that's done Krav Maga, it's pretty nuts. But
what is that?
It's an Israeli, I guess I would call it like a martial arts, but it's what their special forces learn, or maybe all of their military learns Krav Maga. But it's like a lot of like weapons training and hands-on combat. And I haven't practiced it, but both my parents actually practice Krav Maga. And the idea that I get from my ignorant point of view on it is that it's all about like just mass damage as fast as you possibly can.
Got it.
So it's like just fuck you up, get out of my way. Like
so it's like a berserker system.
I'm not familiar with that. Like I know what a berserker is, but
well, right, but it's just that in a system.
Yeah, pretty much.
Like just
yeah, but not so much like organized military, but it's more like individual combat. It's like if shit goes down, how do you defend yourself and get out alive by any means necessary, like groin shots and just some crazy shit. But anyway, I could have done that some disservice.
That's
so
okay.
Anybody curious? Go
I
look it
had
up,
no
you'll find-
perspective, and you just gave me enough to follow along with your story.
So, like that. So yeah, I digress. If we're looking at the United States, like we propped up Israel for a long time and provided military support so that, if somebody in the Middle East decided that they didn't want Israel there, it's like, well, now you also have to involve the United States, and people just generally don't want to do that because of all the things that we just discussed.
Right.
But yeah, to your point, Tony, like it kind of feels like this is one of our examples here of installation of powers. Like, as long as we can maintain this military presence, we've got all the power that we want, despite maybe oppressing like a culture or not giving a certain country an opportunity to rise up on its own,
Or insulating ourselves from the progress that could be made if we had friends instead of enemies.
yes,
Like,
or even looking. Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just saying, because I think I'm right. Correct me if I'm wrong, but after we dropped the bombs on Japan, they were like, war's not our thing. Let's move into technology. And the tech stuff that they do, better than the shit we do.
It's unrivaled. Yeah.
Yeah, but we can go kick your shit in and send missiles everywhere. And I'm like, man, at some point we got to outgrow that.
Yeah. Well, at some point we'll have to outgrow that because, like, I really think that the next stage of warfare isn't missiles. It's crippling your satellite and communication infrastructure.
Yep.
Your internet. Like, that's what everything runs on now. If you can stop that.
It's economic warfare.
Yeah, or economic warfare, exactly. Like, there's so many other ways in today's world to fight a war. So, yeah, I think it's interesting. Tony, you wrote down a couple other things that I thought were interesting, and I want to hear more about your thoughts here. Oil industry and electric cars.
So it was my perspective prior to doing some digging that, I heard tossed around. I never looked into it. That we had the technology for electric cars for decades, but because of the money and push behind big oil, we never pursued it. So I'll give you a little bit longer theoretical version, and then I'll kind of deep dive into kind of what I found. But basically the picture that was painted for me was that, I mean, obviously we see shit getting crazy with the weather and stuff this year with all sorts of craziness, more than usual. We just had two hurricanes come through, tornadoes, earthquakes, fires. Like, 2020 has been weird, man, in every way, shape, and form. So global warming type stuff. And we know that, the carbon emissions and shit with all of that. So obviously there's a reason to not be doing the stuff we're doing, but we haven't cared because those in power were getting their pockets greased by it. Like, if you had an income stream that was an oil income stream, like, I think billions and billions of dollars, and people are like, yeah, but the planet. Again, taking emotion out of it, putting myself in those shoes, I could see myself laughing. Like, you kidding me? You want me to give up these billions just to, I hope I would be a better person than that in that situation if it happened to me, but I get it,
Yeah, not trying to justify it, but it's like I can understand why somebody would feel that way.
100%.
Yeah.
And even thinking about electricity as a replacement. Cool. Like, now Tesla's making, hybrid cars and electric only cars, and it's now more available for us. But if I'm the oil guy, I'm terrified of this because people running their cars, running their stuff off of oil, that's my money. That's my legacy I'm handing to my kids and their kids and their kids, because that's how it's been handed down to me. Yeah, I'm going to do whatever I can to protect that generational income stream to pass down, because electricity, in comparison to oil, hella cheap. And so it's not the income stream, even if you do try to shift and position yourself as the replacement. So when that story was sold to me, I was like, this makes a lot of sense. This makes a lot of sense. Well, let's go find out some more about it. And what I found out was that might not have necessarily been the case. I think there's probably some truth to that, where the money was in the big oil industry and they probably shifted research in a way or tried to push stuff down. But a lot of what I was finding in here is that the electric cars were not as usable as like the oil cars. You have to charge it up. It can't go as far.
Battery technology just isn't quite there.
Battery technology was not there. And so it was more how we decided to use cars and oil-powered technology that more shifted it. So I'm sure there's some truth in the like, hey, we don't need to go figure out how to do electric cars. We can just stay with this. That probably slowed progress down. But it wasn't until, recently that, and actually, as I'm looking here at the notes, electric cars actually starting off were much more popular than oil cars in the early 1900s. But when Ford was able to mass produce the Model T in the 1920s, also with cheap gas at the time, it made it economically available for everyone. And then because of the mass production, now you have market penetration and it's normal and it's hard to slowly overturn that.
Well, and also you have gas stations. Like
Yeah.
one of the things that I think about with Tesla, which it seems like Elon Musk has kind of recognized this, but one of the problems is, like, let's say I want to go from Nashville to California, and it's like, well, where am I going to get my quote unquote gas or electricity? And so he's built like supercharge stations throughout the country. And so he's trying to solve that problem. But like, if you don't have that infrastructure there, well, that's probably a big selling point for oil or like gasoline fueled cars, is I can just stop and fill up and keep going.
You think of those, like 18-wheelers that are constantly driving all day, every day, just to keep everything supplied everywhere. Electricity is not an option for them.
Because they can't afford to stop for 6 hours and charge up a battery.
Or the infrastructure to even do that isn't anywhere.
Sure.
They'd have to plan and change their routes just to the few hubs that are there. Like we have probably another 10, 20 years if we are fully moving to an electric system for that shit to catch up. And then the charging capability has to greatly exceed as well.
So if I ask myself, why is battery technology where it needs to be? And it's either you can do really good batteries so that you don't have to charge as often, or you can do like really good chargers so that they charge really fast, right? There are kind of two basic solutions I see here. So why is it that battery technology is not where it needs to be? And why is it that charging technology isn't where it needs to be? One of the things that comes to mind is this exact concept of insulation of power gets in the way of progress. If you're an oil owner and you've got billions of dollars to invest, and somebody comes to you and says, hey, I've got this really cool idea. It's an electric battery that will last a super long time. I think I've got kind of like the basic ideas figured out, but I need a team of engineers to help me figure it out. Well, as an oil company owner, I might think that that's a great investment, but it's like, dude, I can't have that.
Yeah.
I'm going to buy your patent.
Yep.
And now I'm going to own it, and I'm never going to let that patent come to fruition.
And isn't it something like 20 years or something like that after someone has a patent that you can't replicate it?
I'm not sure. I think it depends on
Okay.
what the patent is, but I'm talking on my ass a little bit.
Because I thought there was it was only for a certain amount of time. And after 20
they do
years
expire.
or something, and you can't just re-up it. Like it just becomes, hey, it's public knowledge and anyone can go do this now. So I think that might be why we're starting to see some of the electric stuff pop up, like with Tesla, because a lot of those patents that maybe have been early and maybe they weren't economically available, and out of fear or self-preservation, they were, let's sit on this.
I think a lot of it has to do with it took a multi-billionaire to say, hey, I'm going to make this my mission.
Yeah.
I've got the resources to do this, and I'm going to go do it.
And
I
if it
think
wasn't
that's
for his capital, would we have seen it?
right, because otherwise it's all wrapped up in somebody else's decisions and things. So it is empowering
Yeah.
to be able to amass that type of wealth. But yeah, I think it's interesting. So like, if that's true, and I have heard many examples of like oil companies buying up electric patents. That's a very real example of this insulation of power inhibits progress. One other one that came to mind since you brought up Tesla is Nikola Tesla back in, I think this is the early 1900s. I mean, hell, I don't know. But anyway, you got this, back in the day when electricity was very new, you had two different types. You had AC and DC. And I don't know all the details here, but I had heard some conversation about like this war between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison, where Tesla had alternating current, AC, and then Edison had direct current, I think is what DC stands for.
Makes sense.
And so I just kind of did like a quick search so that I could have a little bit of more conversation about this since we're live right now. So this is definitely something to go read up on if you're interested. But I'll read you just a quick passage. This is from energy.gov. So it seems like a pretty credible source if you trust the government. But no, I think this is pretty well documented. So Edison, not wanting to lose the royalties he was earning from his direct current patents, began a campaign to discredit alternating current.
Damn.
He spread misinformation saying that alternating current was more dangerous, even going so far as to publicly electrocute stray animals using alternating current to prove his point. So like this is something where Tesla came and was like, hey, you know what? I think I've actually got the solution to this problem. The problem had to do with voltage, and it's over my head. So if anybody's an electrical engineer,
Right.
let us know what the real issue with DC is. But Tesla comes, he says, hey, I've got the solution, and somebody with maybe a little bit more capital, a little bit more resources, spread misinformation, lied to make sure that his position of power was not being undermined.
Yep. Well, and again, I have not done enough looking into it, but I think allegedly, like Tesla was onto some like free energy shit.
Yeah, so like the idea of the Tesla tower was something to the effect of like he would have this tower and the tower would transmit electricity through the air, and you could have little receptacles that would pull down that electricity. And so kind of in the same sense that radio waves work is how I envision it.
Yeah.
Again, I haven't really researched this, but
again, hypothetically, let's say that's it, and what it is and how it's supposed to work. That's a loss of control from lots of greater and then smaller local governments. Because guess what? I don't have to charge people. I can't just go direct turn off your phone or your electric line if you're not paying for it. That's a form of control. Well, guess what? We just, you know what? What if electricity, since we're in, 2020, what if electricity was just a basic human right?
it's interesting that you bring that up. And sorry, I may be getting off topic here, so
I don't
steer
care.
us back on course. But I was listening to the case for internet almost being a right. And specifically today, because so many children are having to use the internet to go to school during this pandemic. Like, my personal view is that I don't know if I'm quite ready to say that it should be like a right. But at the same time, I can't, you're really not giving people a leg up or an opportunity to grow without the internet. Kind of like, I think we started to say that at the start of this podcast.
Or even if you take a step down from that, you can't have the internet without electricity.
Right.
How do we do most of our cooking? How do we preserve our food? How do we wash our clothes? How do we clean ourselves? We need electricity to pull the water in. Like, in my mind, I think food, water, and electricity and access to the internet probably should be basic human rights.
Yeah.
And let's find a way to give that to everybody without putting these weird, shitty Comcast gaps in it.
Right. And I think that's kind of one of the things that came up with phones also.
Yeah.
Like I remember back when Obama was president and they had the branded Obama phones. That was kind of one of the ideas there too.
I did not hear about that at all.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Obama phones were a big thing, and it was. I was too young to really look into it, so I don't know all the details. But it was something to the effect of like, everybody should be able to have a phone because you can use it for emergencies and things like that. And
Makes sense.
like, I think my viewpoint is that as long as we can find a way to fund something, then I think things like healthcare and internet and electricity can be provided.
Yeah.
But we've got to figure out how the funding works.
I'm with that 100%. That makes sense to me too.
So like if I were president, I would look at a way and I would look at the internet and be like, if I want my country to be as good as it possibly can be, the internet and giving good access to it is going to be a huge step forward with that. So why not try to find a way to do it? I'm not saying that I could or that we could.
Right. But
it's like,
let's try.
Wouldn't we want to at least explore the idea? So
Yeah, if we can figure out over the period of a couple, decades how to put computers from that, the smallest one was the size of a room to we carry them around in our pockets. I think we can figure out shit like this.
Yeah,
You know what I
think
mean?
So too. So that's my viewpoint on it. Like, I think it all has to be afforded.
Sure.
So,
Well, and I think the struggle from getting to that hypothetical future reality is you've got Time Warner, you've got Comcast, you've got all of these big companies that what they do is internet service. So if you're going to make that available for everyone for free or have a different way to pay for that, you got to get them agreeing to either receive the government funded pay that they're going to give for that, which is probably going to be less than what they charge consumers for it. So that's a hurdle. Or you've got to find a way to shut all of that down and completely turn it into government, which I know a lot of people are afraid of and don't want that to happen because that's leaning more towards socialism. And people are, especially in this country, and seeing how extreme forms of socialism in other countries that we've gone to war with and tried to stop their progress. That's another hurdle to get across as well.
yeah, so I think like it almost seems to me like socialism is what we should strive for, but we have to figure out how to actually make it work.
Yeah, I think on paper, like I think anyone would agree with me saying that communism or socialism on paper is fantastic. In practice, we've not seen good examples, at least not sustainable ones, right? It always ends with somebody going, oh, this is a system I could control. Thank you.
Yep.
And then they don't relinquish it. And then shit goes to shit.
Sounds like all these other examples that we've gone down.
I know. But I don't think because we've tried things and they've gone bad doesn't mean we should stop trying.
Right. And I think that's where I kind of stand on like the providing internet is like, why not try to keep exploring that idea and see if we can figure it out? Google is doing something interesting with their like huge, are they like balloons or something that they're putting up? So check this out. I'll just do a quick search for it. But Google has this idea that they can put up like, we'll call them internet balloons.
Okay.
And the idea is exactly what we're describing. Oh, so first of all, Alphabet is the parent company to Google.
Okay.
Loon, that's Loon LLC, is an Alphabet subsidiary working on providing internet access to rural and remote areas. The company uses high altitude balloons in the stratosphere about 18 to 25 kilometers up.
So
God, I wish I knew what a kilometer was.
Not quite a satellite, I'm assuming.
Right. Yeah. So like, let's say 20 kilometers up. So that's around 10 miles up. So that'd be 52,000 feet in the air. So like twice as high as planes fly. Okay.
Okay.
And so it would basically just create this wireless network in this little bubble that it could cast down, just like a satellite does. But a satellite might be able to hit like, 7 countries all at once, or like an entire range of longitude. Whereas the loon might only be able to hit, 200 square miles.
Okay.
That's arbitrary, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that with these balloons, Google, who has all these resources and can afford to do this, can put these balloons up over Africa and give everybody access to, it says, 1 megabit per second speeds, which is, you're not going to stream, but kind of goes back to like the internet for education. It's like you can access the World Wide Web and read all of the material that's available. I think YouTube, I call it YouTube University, is a great resource. And so it'd be awesome if everybody could have like 3 or 5 megabit per second and easily watch YouTube videos. But yeah, those types of things help. I heard about a kid who went to a library and literally learned how to make like his own, what was it? I think it was like his own radio tower or something like that, and just fucking did it. And this is like in the middle of Africa.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it was some wild stuff. It may have been more significant than a radio tower. It may have been like some way to get electricity or something.
It's
but yeah.
funny how a lot of people still don't understand YouTube University, because and for anyone listening, that's not a real thing. That's just what me and Nick call free learning education on YouTube, because people will go out and, you know, they're trying to make a couple extra bucks from ad revenue. Or maybe they just want to share some knowledge that they have. And so they'll make a video on here's how to change oil in your car on this specific model. Or
it only takes another 10 minutes for me to move the camera and position it. So like, might as well.
Yep. And so you can go on and pretty much figure out how to do absolutely anything and have a video of someone who's doing it showing you how to do it. Granted, the only thing you're missing is someone's not there to ask questions.
Right.
You can probably comment and they might answer you. I'm like, why do I need college again? Sure, we probably shouldn't do YouTube University for surgeries. All right, I will give that. Or maybe really technical, intense things. You probably can't rely on just somebody showing you, but you could probably get a lot of the way there and figure out the rest, right? As long as there's not big risk involved, like, oh, someone's bleeding out. Well, let me pull up a YouTube video.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Shit. If nobody else is there and they're a doctor and you don't know CPR,
yeah, that's
I might
a good
sit
point.
there and actually pull out YouTube and be like, how do I do CPR? I'm going to give this a shot.
Yeah.
Like, I got to save a life. Nobody else is here. It's all on my shoulders.
Yeah. Piggybacking off of this conversation and circling back to that whole like, ooh, America's slipping from that #1 spot, or that beacon of hope was a good way to put it. If we want to get back there, I think an easy way would be, oh, okay, cool. Well, let's make education not so damn expensive and gated. Let's make access to information and not make it so damn conflicting everywhere. Sure, let's let people have their voice, but let's not set it up to fight ourselves internally. And let's just force everyone to be equipped with all that. You know what I mean? I'm sure there's ways you could incentivize people to go learn and create shit, but we're not.
Yeah, if I had a call to action for every person in the world, I think my one call to action would be find a way to explore your curiosities.
Hell yeah, dude.
Like, I think it's if you have a thought and you're like, well, how does that work? If you've got the time, or if you don't, try to find the time. If you can, and find a way to prioritize it, go explore that. Because no matter what your that is, it's something that you've considered. And if you can figure it out, then that makes you just that much less susceptible to being controlled and manipulated. And Tony, I think that might be my takeaway here.
Yeah.
Is that like...
That is... I don't even need a takeaway today because that one's so damn good.
But like, I think about, all of these examples, that seems to be kind of the key, is we've got to take ownership of ourselves so that we can be less susceptible to being controlled. Just like those who could read were less susceptible to being controlled by the Catholic Church.
Yeah. And so I think the problem that I have, or the struggle that I have, is patience, and knowing that good change takes time. And so even this last example we talked about, people having access to information or, internet electricity for people, that can't happen tomorrow. Even if collectively we agreed and said, yes, this is a great idea, let's go make it happen. You still have a decade of putting the infrastructure together to make it a reality. And so I guess my takeaway would be giving myself and collectively everyone else the patience to explore that curiosity, and then let the answer to those questions come to life. Because if you have questions, they probably should be answered, right? And just because they're not easily answered doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue them. I mean, that's why we're here digging in, asking all these questions and making stuff. So, yeah, it's a good convo today, man.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I think it was interesting to dive in. And I think that if you look throughout the world, I think we'll start noticing a lot more examples of where power was put before progress.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's a shame.
Maybe, this might take some digging, because maybe we're just so conditioned to see the negative side of things, but maybe we do another episode that says the flip side of this conversation. Like you gave one example of George Washington, but where progress was put in front of power.
Mm-hmm. That'd be like the real heroes.
Yeah, right? If we can find enough examples to talk about it. But
certainly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for listening. Really enjoyed talking to you, Tony. And we'll be on the lookout for more.
All right. Sounds good.